in standby, I want to bring in former Israeli peace negotiator Daniel Levy into this conversation. Daniel, it's good to have you. First, I want to get a sense of what you make of the president being, and let's describe it as being caught off guard. We've seen Trump very publicly lash out at Israel during the Iran conflict. Do you think Trump has a handle on this situation, and very specifically on Netanyahu at this point?
You know, I'm not sure he does, Becky, for one very simple reason, which is to get that, you have to acknowledge that this is an Israeli leader going for an endgame outcome where Israel is dominant in the region, where the Palestinians are finished. As far as he is concerned, he's trying to drive the ethnic cleansing of the Palestinians. So if you're an American president and you take at face value an Israeli leader who is telling you, Mr. President, we take the lead on this, you just come in to take the glory, we've already weakened the Iranians, now we can go ahead and we'll build a Pax Americana, Mr. President, with Israel in the lead, and the other countries will come under our umbrella because they've got no choice. But if you premise that on bombing everywhere and on, really, let's look at those pictures out of Gaza, carrying out a genocide as is now well documented. If you premise it on that, then you really lose that floating Arab vote. You're not going to get peace. And the American president, I think, who is used to an Israel that, yeah, they're like us, I don't think it's easy to acknowledge the reality. If you acknowledge the reality, you have to do more than use words. You have to use your leverage with an Israeli leader, which American presidents are traditionally loath to do. This president isn't traditional, so let's see.
Yeah, you're making a really interesting point, and I want to bring up something that you recently wrote. You said, quote, Netanyahu's horizon, of course, extends beyond Gaza. His narrative is that if Iran is downsized and contained, its wings sufficiently clipped, then a new and reorganized Middle East can be birthed. I wonder what you believe the US position on this sort of Israeli expansionism is, as it were, first in the Palestinian territories, and then, of course, beyond that, given Israel's actions in Iran, Lebanon, and now in Syria in this past week.
So we heard for decades, primarily Netanyahu, because he was the Israeli leader most of this time, that if you could bring down the Iranians, cut them down to size, this was the head of the snake, they would call it, then we can just redo the region and it's all going to be fabulous. You're hardly going to expect the Israeli leader to drop that narrative at the moment when he claims victory in having achieved that. And he's achieved his biggest success, which is to bring the Americans into bombing Iran. That was the long-standing effort. So now you actually have to test the proposition. First of all, Iran hasn't been weakened nearly as much as they're claiming. But even if you take it that much further, then you say, okay, Israel, well, what are you willing to do now to create an environment in the region which makes things easier for those other countries to come alongside you? And Israel saying, no, 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 that's not what we intended. What we're telling you is they will accept our preeminence, our dominance, our hegemony, that we can do anything we want, and especially against the Palestinians. They will have to accept that as a fait accompli. But I think the region is looking at this and saying, wait a minute, the Palestinians is an issue that resonates with our public. We can come close to you, Israel. But when people see on their screens every day forced starvation, mass killings, just the human suffering inflicted by you, that is not a place we can move towards. And therefore, much of the region is saying, this is just another baloney new Middle East scheme. We've heard of them for so long, none of them come true. And in this instance, we see Israel actually as the most radicalizing, revisionist state in the region that's winding everyone up and that's destabilizing the region. And some of those states are now saying, maybe Israel's going to have a go at us next. We have to be prepared for this. We can't let it happen.
So, and I want to come back to you on that and get a little bit more from you on what you believe some of the countries who've already signed Abraham Accords, for example, with Israel, how you believe they stand, and then with Saudi Arabia, who we are told would normalise were it not for the Palestinian issue. Just work out where we are at with that. Before I do that, Kevin, look, Daniel really echoing what I hear as many of Netanyahu's critics around the region, who certainly contend this is no longer a strategy of deterrence and it's more a deliberate campaign to preemptively reshape the region, according to Israel's maximalist ambitions. Do you get a sense from your sources at the White House that Donald Trump is considering any change in policy on Israel-Gaza? Is he willing to enact any meaningful repercussions, as it were, against Netanyahu at this point?
Frankly, it doesn't seem as if that's in the president's thinking at the moment. As Daniel was saying, President Trump has joined a long string of American presidents who seem unwilling to use the leverage that the U.S. does have over Israel to try and exact any changes in how it's conducting its war. But as he also mentioned, and it is also true, that Trump is an untraditional president who has in the past been willing to entertain options that his predecessors sort of cast aside. At this point, I think the president is still holding out hope that this ceasefire arrangement will come to fruition. And it does seem as if the holdout right now is Hamas leadership in Gaza, still waiting to hear back on this proposal that would allow some of the hostages to come out. The president very much holding out hope that that effort will finally, after so many previous attempts fell through, that this will be the time that a ceasefire, at least a temporary one, is struck. But you know, these images coming out of Gaza are very powerful, and they have had an effect on the president. This is someone who is moved by imagery. He's a visual guy. These are images that have disturbed him, one, but also seem to imperil his goal of achieving a Nobel Peace Prize. This is his overarching dream, and I think the longer that the Gaza war persists, the longer that this famine takes hold, as more and more children die from starvation, the president sees that goal becoming further and further from reach. And you can sort of envision the president at some point coming to Netanyahu and saying, this is enough and I'm willing to do X, Y, Z to bring this war to an end. But what that X, Y, and Z aren't exactly clear. It's very difficult to imagine, for instance, the U.S. cutting off arms to Israel under President Trump or cutting aid to Israel under President Trump. That's not necessarily a politically tenable position for a Republican in the United States. And so even if the president wanted to change his policy towards Israel in a dramatic way, it's not precisely clear what the options in front of him might be.
And let me bring you back in, Daniel. There is an argument that Netanyahu has effectively done the bidding for many in the region where I am, in the Gulf, in reshaping the security architecture across the Middle East, potentially birthing a broader peace picture. So this Israeli expansionism that you speak of, do you see that as being acceptable to the signatories of the Abraham Accords or to Saudi Arabia? And I'm talking sort of perhaps medium to long term here. These are countries, and very specifically the Saudis, who the Americans really badly want to see normalised with Israel at this point.
So it's an interesting balancing act. I think it's fair to look at it in that way. On the one hand, many of those countries designated Hamas a terrorist organization and were apparently none too perturbed by seeing Hamas brought down several pegs. They have had their issues with Iran. That's something that changed recently. Each of them have had a lot of outreach to Iran. But yeah, you know, Iran in a less strident position, certainly Iran's allied forces elsewhere in the region. Yeah, we can tick that box. However, then you have to look at the other side of the equation. Is the ethnic cleansing and genociding of the Palestinians their comfort zone? Even if for some of them, Palestinians aren't what they wake up and think about in the morning, it's a very uncomfortable place to be with your own public. The Saudi position on normalization, I think, has moved significantly as a consequence. When it comes to Iran, yes, Iran has been something that appeared significantly in their mapping of their threats in the region. But to have an Iran that is less predictable, that maybe with its back up against the wall might do things that it didn't do. Or, and I think this is crucial, because people are increasingly realizing that this is what Israel seems to have in mind, to have an Iran as a collapsed, failing state. Because Israel doesn't believe its own hype about neat regime change, it becomes pro-Israel, pro-American. If that's what they're trying to achieve, to have collapse, well, that didn't go so well for everyone else when it happened in Iraq. And they don't want to see that either there. And likewise in Syria. So you have this kind of competition between those who want to see stability, but an Israel which seems to have gone off on its own totally different journey, which is we are going to dictate the entire terms of the settlement. And now you have countries. Look at Turkey, for instance, not an Arab country, but an important country in the region. They're now hearing what the Israelis are saying. And inside Israel, you have an increasing drumbeat. Turkey's next. Turkey's not going to sit on the sidelines and wait for that to happen. So I think a lot of countries are looking at this and saying someone has to bring this out of control state to heal, especially since having now seemingly attempted in their way to address Iran's nuclear program, we're reminded that there is one nuclear armed state in the region, and that is Israel. So when you put all of those things together, it's a bit of a worrying package for many of the states in the region who may well have lent into the idea that the best way is to make common cause with Israel. The other thing that one really mustn't forget in all this, Becky, if I may, is Israel internally itself. The idea that Israel can be permanently at war, keep expanding the contours of who it is at war with, be so dependent on the US, by the way, at a time where Israel has become more controversial inside both Democrat and Republican MAGA circles, and the idea that Israeli society can sustain that. It's a small country, not an endless supply of reservists. It has serious vulnerabilities, and many would look at this and say Israel is storing up for itself a disaster. Of course, it may not come quick enough for those Palestinians in Gaza, West Bank, and elsewhere who are going through hell and beyond, but this may well blow up in Israel's face.
Right. Daniel, it's good to have you. Kevin, thank you for your reporting. Important stuff. Thank you.